Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the curtain, or more accurately, the rough, scratchy wool blanket on one of the most personal yet profoundly misunderstood parts of medieval life. Forget everything you've seen in movies. Forget the sweeping romance of fairy tales, the passionate trysts in moonlit gardens, or the very notion of marrying for love. We are about to venture into a world where intimacy was not a choice, but a debt, a spiritual, legal, and social bill that could be called due at any time, governed not by affection or desire, but by a complex and often bizarre set of rules handed down by the church. This is a story about how the most private aspects of a person's life were made relentlessly public. We're going to explore a time when marriage was less a romantic union and more a cold, hard business deal, often sealed before the couple had even exchanged more than a few awkward words. We will delve into the strange and intrusive world of the conjugal debt, a theological concept that turned the marital bed into a place of contractual obligation, where refusal was not just a personal matter, but a sin that had to be confessed to your local priest. Along the way, we'll uncover the church's bizarre calendar of approved and forbidden nights, turning intimacy into a scheduled, highly regulated event. We'll see how pleasure was viewed with suspicion and how privacy was a fantasy, making the most intimate moments a public duty. We'll also explore the immense burden placed on medieval women, whose value was often reduced to their ability to produce heirs, and the strange theoretical equality that allowed a wife to, in principle, demand her dues from a negligent husband in a church court. So, before we get into the strange, solemn, and often awkward details, if you want to support the work that goes into these deep dives, take a moment to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. And, as always, I'm fascinated to see our global community come together. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, find a comfortable spot, and let's explore why for centuries love was an afterthought and duty was everything. To truly wrap our heads around the medieval world, we have to perform a small but crucial act of mental gymnastics. We need to take our modern definition of marriage, a partnership built on love, personal choice, and mutual affection, and lock it away in a small, secure box. It will be of no use to us here. In the Middle Ages, the concept of marrying for love was, for the vast majority of the population, as alien as the idea of electricity or a reliable plumbing system. It wasn't the goal. It wasn't even on the list of considerations. Marriage wasn't the culmination of a romance. It was the beginning of a business arrangement, a social contract designed for one thing above all else: survival. For the overwhelming majority of people, the peasants, who made up over 90% of the population, life was a relentless grind. It was a cycle of back-breaking labor in the fields, governed by the rising and setting of the sun 6 days a week. Your world was small, often limited to the 10-mile radius around the village where you were born. In this context, marriage was a deeply pragmatic decision. It was a pooling of resources, a combining of labor. A strong husband could plow the fields. A resourceful wife could manage the household, tend the small garden, and spin wool into cloth. Together, they had a slightly better chance of not starving during the lean winter months. Children were not seen through the rosy lens of parental joy, but as future farmhands, extra bodies to help with the harvest as soon as they were old enough to walk. Love? Affection? If it blossomed between a couple amidst the mud, sweat, and toil, it was a beautiful and welcome surprise, a rare flower growing in stony ground. But it was never the reason for the union. You didn't choose a spouse for their charming smile or witty conversation. You chose them for their sturdy back and their family's small plot of land. Imagine the gentle, creaking darkness of a medieval night. You lie on a straw-stuffed pallet somewhere between sleep and an unending to-do list, listening to the wind sigh through the cracks in the wooden walls. The fire has faded. Someone nearby is snoring. And on the other side of the room, a room you share with perhaps children, perhaps a parent, and, if fate is unkind, perhaps the family goat, your spouse stirs. You know that look. It's not the look of love, or at least not the kind that launches 1,000 poems. Tonight, that look carries the heavy, practical weight of medieval obligation. Tonight, you're reminded that in this world, married people owe each other more than shared blankets and occasional soup. They owe each other the conjugal debt. The conjugal debt. Even the name is heavy, like an overdue bill that never quite goes away. In our time, it sounds absurd, but here, in the soft, flickering candlelight of the 14th century, it is as real as your aching back and as inescapable as tomorrow's chores. You see, in the Middle Ages, marriage was not only a partnership, but a formal contract, one carefully overseen by the church, that most vigilant of marriage counselors. And unlike modern counselors, the church kept very close tabs. Imagine a nosy aunt who also controls your afterlife. The conjugal debt was the promise at the heart of that contract. If your spouse asks for physical affection, however they phrased it in those times, a nudge, a frown, a long sigh, you were expected to pay up. Not paying was not just a social faux pas. It was considered a sin, and not a small one. This obligation wasn't occasional or reserved for moments of mutual delight. It was expected. To refuse, except for illness, religious fasting, or other well-argued reasons, was to risk the immortal soul of your partner. Or at least, that's what the priest said. Picture Johann and Matilde, a peasant couple, huddled under a wool blanket that hasn't seen soap since last Easter. Privacy? None. There are children breathing quietly in the straw, an in-law tucked by the fire, a goat stamping its foot in the corner. But when conjugal debt is invoked, all else fades briefly out, at least in theory. Matilde rolls over, Johann sighs,
and the silent rituals of duty commence. Sometimes they find a rare moment of warmth. Sometimes it's just another chore, like hauling water or patching another tunic. Now, you might hope that the higher-ups fared better. Maybe nobility, with their heavy curtains and feather beds, experienced a spark of romance? Afraid not. For the lords and ladies, marriage was business, politics, and legacy. The bed was a battleground, but the rules were unchanged. If Lady Beatrice summoned Lord Oswald, he was supposed to answer, even if his mind was on his next joust, or on the business of producing an heir. Ladies could, in rare cases, invoke their rights before a church court if they were neglected, and there are records of determined wives bringing their complaints, demanding that their husbands be ordered to fulfill their duties. The grand ironies of history: a grand hall, a nervous husband, a solemn priest reading from canon law about the duties of the marriage bed. And then always the calendar. The church's relentless calendar dictated dozens of no-go days each year. Lent, Advent, feast days, Sundays, even certain phases of the moon. On those days, the conjugal debt was suspended for the good of your souls. Peasants could joke about how often the holy days lined up with old aches, mysterious headaches, or feigned sleep. Still, outside those marked days, the expectation remained, a quietly hovering pressure pulsing beneath the hay and homespun. What if someone said no? Not just maybe later, but I cannot. The church was clear, especially after marriage, that the refusal of conjugal rights without serious cause was grounds for confession, penance, and possibly even annulment. Such cases weren't common, too much at stake, and far too much gossip. Still, the confessional at the end of a cold winter had heard more than a few complaints about neglect, or sometimes the opposite problem: my spouse is too insistent, Father, and the saint's calendar is not enough rest. What about love? Was there none? There was, sometimes, hidden between chores, under a shared blanket, in an occasional, unexpected gesture. Affection lived in the quiet acts of looking out for each other, a heel of bread saved for later, a back rubbed after a hard day, a rare, honest laugh in the dark. Yet, for most, love was the happy accident, not the reason for marriage, and certainly not the focus of this debt. Thousands of households all over Europe paid their conjugal bills endlessly, quietly, as a fact of existence. No declarations, just a series of small nods and sighs, and now and then a resigned kind of partnership that weathered years, children, hunger, and time. Let's not forget the village priest, keeper of souls, and sometimes unwilling marital referee. Every confession booth in Christendom saw its share of whispered worries. I was tired, Father, and said no. Have I doomed him? The priest would sigh, being no stranger himself to the limits of human patience, and offer absolution and perhaps some advice. Next time, my child, remember duty before comfort, but perhaps also a little kindness. The conjugal debt, at its best, was a way for partners, at least in theory, to assert a kind of mutuality, a recognition that partnership must be two-sided. At its worst, it was a looming obligation, a duty demanded more often than desired, a source of quiet frustration or resignation. Still, even obligation can sometimes grow something unexpected, A stubborn, weather-beaten kind of loyalty. A willingness to keep showing up, to pay the bill not because it brings bliss, but because it's owed. Some couples, like Johann and Matilde, found their way from obligation to quiet affection, a joke shared, a squeeze of the hand, the sense that, at least here, in this cold, unpredictable world, there was someone to suffer and survive with. And thus, as history moves on, the conjugal debt, so strange, so formal, so businesslike, beginning to fade away, replaced slowly, clumsily, by ideas of love, consent, and affection chosen rather than owed.
Imagine a medieval night as it crawls across the village. The wind rattles through a patchwork wall of mud and wattle. Straw shifts under you. Somewhere a child murmurs, and the goat rearranges itself with a thud suspiciously close to your one prized cup. You and almost everyone you know have survived another day of tilling, mending, kneading, waiting, and hoping the harvest comes in thick for once. But as the last embers in the hearth glow beneath their snowy hat of ashes, there is no real rest from the world's duties. Because after darkness falls, another set of demands arrives, ones that are half whispered, half rules, and wholly inescapable. And tonight, soft as a prayer, the air in your crowded little home carries the pressure of a question that was once sacred and now mostly just heavy. Why does anyone here have the right to share a bed at all? If you think the answer is love or desire or the need to be close on the coldest nights, you're thinking like a visitor. In the Middle Ages, when the church set the rules, the only acceptable reason for intimacy, no matter how much the world ached for warmth, was procreation. All else was at best a tolerated accident, and at worst, a pathway to sin. No one embodied this more than our friends Johann and Matilda. Each night, as they folded themselves together under a wool blanket that had outlived its original owner, they found not just each other, but the invisible third party of the church, hunched on the end of the bed in the form of memory, rules, and unrelenting scrutiny. Matilde, like every woman in the parish, could quote the priest's favorite sermons, even when she half wished she couldn't. Go forth and multiply, be fruitful, he'd intone, as if the only truly Christian crop was the next generation. And so when Johann reached for her or she for him, somewhere inside both was the unfailing, weary mental calculus of duty. Did this act have a holy enough purpose? Was it for children, or only for the comfort in the fleeting, forbidden flicker of joy? In secret, perhaps, both remembered what grandmother used to whisper about a time before prayers, when people just found each other and let the seasons explain the rest. But that world was gone. The church, in its worry about bodies, had made sure to give desire a tight, holy fence. All pleasure was suspect, unless carefully disguised as the hope for offspring. So, for centuries, the church became the great manager of bids. Church fathers with ink-stained hands, foggy with self-denial, crafted endless treatises on the reasons and rhythms of marital life. The correct intention, the priest would say, was always openness to new life. Anything else, a sly smile, a moment of stolen comfort, a simple need, carried the scent of sin, or at least of wasted potential. Picture our couple again. Matilde moving softly, the moonlight slipping through the cracks, Johann whispering more to God than to her, that surely a little closeness was no crime after so many months of toil. But the rules are clear. Even a peasant's embrace is supposed to have a future, a purpose, and a prayer for another baby. Wanting each other for comfort, for laughter, for anything the priest might call mere recreation was a risk that would require confession when the next feast day rolled around. Of course, this logic wound its way all the way to the stone-walled bedrooms of the nobility. For Lord Oswald and Lady Beatrice, matters were even more official. Their union was written into ledgers and treaties, sealed not so much in wax as in bloodlines. Procreation meant heirs, alliances, the stability of the realm, but still, the message was the same. Intimacy was to ensure the future, not soften the present. The bed was a field, plowed for the parentage of yet another son, not a retreat from politics, but its very machinery. Not following the rules, that was dangerous. If not for your soul, then for your reputation and your standing. The local priest, part shepherd, part auditor, could demand the details of your intention, and sometimes did. Confessionals were thick with anxieties. Father, I'm worried my thoughts were not pure. Or, Father, forgive me. Our union last week was not for a child, but because we missed each other. Penances piled up, whispered instructions handed out like bitter medicine to ensure the flock stayed in line. Even the calendar colluded. The church marked out vast stretches of the year when intimacy was forbidden, no matter what your intention. Lent, Advent, feast days, saints' days, and Sundays, layering guilt onto any warmth that might otherwise have snuck between Matilde and Johann, or Lady Beatrice and her distant, distracted lord. Sometimes looking at the ever-complicated chart, a couple found themselves waiting weeks or even months for a single night when both permission and desire lined up at last. Still, the rules were difficult. The lines blurred. So people muddled through, hoping, praying, or simply ignoring the details when hearts went out over doctrine. The peasant couple, pressed together by frost and fate, sometimes let the rules slide, trusting that God forgave the weary and the lonely. Occasionally, even among the nobility, affection crept in at the edges, transforming alliance into something closer to partnership, if not quite to romance. But mostly, for hundreds of years, the message held strong. Intimacy was serious and strictly for the sake of children. A joy that arrived by accident was best left unmentioned, and if remembered, confessed quickly and with a promise to do better next time. And yet, human nature, stubborn as wild thyme, resists every fence. Loves are born in spaces the church forgot to block, and comfort is sought when the world grows too cold or too quiet, no matter what the rules say. Even the holiest preacher, if he looked close enough, could see that life has always been filled with more secret kindness, more accidental affection than the biggest doctrine could hope to contain. So as another medieval night closes, even with the goat rumbling against your feet and children sprawling in every direction, know that every law, every prayer, every careful intention was always really just an attempt to contain the wild, messy reality of the human heart. Procreation was the rule, but the need for closeness, for laughter, for someone's arms when the world creaked and groaned, kept slipping in anyway. And in the morning, it all began again. The work, the rules, the unspoken hopes for company in a world where officially, even your tenderness had to justify itself.
It's strange, isn't it, how even on the coldest or loneliest nights, in the packed, noisy blur of medieval family life, the prospect of drawing close to the one person who shares your patch of straw can feel less like a private comfort and more like navigating an obstacle course set by saints, seasons, and the ever-watchful church. You and your partner, Matilda perhaps and Johann, because in this world names run together like patches on a quilt, might eye each other across the room, hesitant and hopeful, only to remember that some higher authority may be marking tonight as out of bounds. For if the troubles and duties of daily medieval life weren't enough to keep couples busy and apart, there existed a far subtler barrier, cutting right through the center of home and hope, the calendar of abstinence. A list longer than the family's collective complaints about goat hair in the soup, more tangled than your weekly supply of string, and as stern as a priest with a headache. The church, determined to keep all souls pointed firmly toward heaven and earthly pleasures in check, had gone and marked nearly half the year as forbidden territory, not for field work, not for feasting, but for any intimacy at all. Picture the scene. The fire is low, the room quiet for once. The children's dreams punctuated only by the occasional twitch or snore. For a brief, rare moment, you and your spouse find yourselves side by side, considering whether, for once, you might trade duty for closeness. But first, a mental recitation, like an invisible checking of locks. Are we in Lent? Is it Advent? Is tomorrow some saint's feast, or is it simply another one of those mysterious rogation days that come around to test your patience and your memory? If you're a truly diligent sort, you might even keep tally pebbles in a clay bowl, sliding them from one side to another, on, off, each one marking yet another forbidden night. 40 days of Lent, 40 more for Advent, every single Sunday, plus Wednesdays here, Fridays there. Feast days? So many you lose count before you reach Pentecost. Holy periods for mourning, for harvest, for the countless, ever-growing list of saints, many of whom, it must be said, were apparently saints for their talent in not having much fun at all. And so it is that you, tired and wishing for comfort, offer Matilda a hopeful glance, only for her to shake her head and mutter, "St. Wilfrid, tomorrow." You don't know what St. Wilfrid did, precisely, but you know he's the reason you're not doing anything. The calendar, you see, isn't merely a chart. It's a living presence. It hangs over the household silently, ticked off in the margins of each day by every good priest, and remembered, when convenient, by every reluctant spouse. The humblest parish priest is, in this respect, more powerful than any feudal lord. His word on what is or isn't permitted at bedtime is gospel, sometimes literally. His sermons, delivered in a stern monotone or with the wistfulness of someone who's read about but never actually tasted honey, remind husbands and wives to keep their intentions pure and their timing correct. Let not the flesh overrule the spirit, my children, especially not during Lent, or on the vigil of Simeon, or on any day that ends in Y, he might say, and the congregation, already half asleep, nods, because what else can you do? No one suffers this more than the newly married. At first, their hope is almost radiant. Surely they might steal a handful of uninterrupted nights to themselves, a brief season before piety places them on opposite sides of the mattress, balancing on the edge of duty and decorum. But the Church has foreseen this, too. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, the old men say, and it often feels as if the moments for the former are scheduled solely to test your memory and willpower. Even the nobility, tucked up in feather beds, surrounded by hangings meant to signal luxury, but mostly smelling of centuries of incense and moth, find themselves tripped by the calendar. Lady Beatrice in her velvet nightgown may dream of love, or at least a respite from responsibility, only to sigh and turn away, counting up the list of forbidden nights faster than a scribe during tax season. Lord Oswald, after a long day of hawking, hunting, or avoiding the steward, might find himself foiled not by politics, but by a note on his wife's rosary. No heirs can be conceived tonight, my lord. It is the feast of St. Agatha. And so they both roll over, resigned, perhaps comforted by the knowledge that at least they're in this together. If they're not producing children, at least neither are their neighbors. Sometimes the months stack up such that for what feels like years, the only thing more prolific than the saints are the excuses. The Church requires restraint, the priest declares, and so restraint is what you practice. Even when the frost creeps in under the shutters and the fire burns low, and the world outside feels less forgiving than anything you could find in each other's arms. Of course, human nature being what it is, not everyone is perfectly obedient. The clever, the bored, and the desperate all find ways to bend the rules, or at least twist the calendar. Some tally the days with more hope than accuracy, quietly deciding that surely the fast of St. Swithin was meant only for monks. Others confess with a wink and a sigh, accepting penance gladly for one more night of breaking the divine routine. The villages buzz with whispered tips. There's no mention of Ember Night in the old calendar. Just ignore Father Tom's latest list and do what feels right. He'll never know, and if he does, say you mixed up St. Bartholomew with St. Bartholomew's Eve. And yet, even these small rebellions only highlight the overall truth. The calendar is as much a character in each marriage as the partners themselves. It brings guilt some nights, relief on others, and sometimes an odd sense of camaraderie, as when all the couples in a parish find themselves on Easter Eve leaning just a little closer to the edge of their straw beds, counting the minutes until midnight. For most, the rules eventually become a rhythm, a dance of duty and waiting, a measure of compliance that settles into everyday life, woven through chores, seasons, and cycles. The children come or do not. The years pass, and in time, whether by grace or simply exhaustion, even the impatient find comfort in the regularity. If affection must be rationed, well, so be it. There were so many other things to bear, why not this too? But the heart, stubborn as spring shoots in frozen soil, keeps beating its own unpredictable pace. Affection, longing, plain loneliness, they all sneak in, calendar or not, sometimes blooming in the accidental pauses when rules slip and hours stretch, sweet and silent. Couples find their own tiny rituals, an extra blanket shared, a hand squeezed in the dark, a wordless look exchanged during chores. These become the places where real intimacy quietly survives, hidden in plain sight, a warm pulse beneath the rituals of caution. So, as the cold wraps itself around the village once more, and the night thickens with the scent of wood smoke, everyone in bed awaits the next sunrise, and the next chance, perhaps, for closeness, when the calendar finally, mercifully, relents. In the end, the holiest of days are not always those marked on the church's scroll, but the unexpected moments of human warmth that manage to sneak through even when every rule said.
By now, you know a few things for certain. The straw of your mattress is never in the right place. The wind cares nothing for schedules. And above all, privacy is not just a luxury. It's a concept from a fairy tale nobody here has ever heard. You wake, if you slept at all, sandwiched between Matilde, a snoring pile of children, and, on luckier nights, a goat with cold hooves but warm intentions. Somewhere at the other end of the hovel, you hear the delicate percussion of a pig rooting through yesterday's ashes, punctuated by a rooster who was not so much announcing dawn as making a personal point about his opinions on sleep. This, then, is home for most of Europe. One room, sometimes two if you're a noble who mismanaged their castle additions. Everything, every secret, every meal, every sniffle is shared here. If you had hopes for a cozy embrace in the night, you'd better get used to spectacle, because even the notion that a married couple might expect a bit of alone time is so foreign as to be actively hilarious. The walls are thin, the floors are either dirt or some heroic experiment with straw and hope, and the ceiling is someone's best guess at what will leak least. You begin your morning not by stretching, but by counting limbs, which ones belong to you, which are Matilde's, and which, as it turns out, are the piglets. In medieval Europe, sleeping arrangements are communal, not by choice, but by conspiracy. Birth order, marital status, visitors,
livestock, and luck all play a role. Sibling rivalry is less about toys and more about prime floor space near the fire. Children are tucked between adults not to build intimacy, but to avoid accidental frostbite, and the elderly, equally cherished and equally in the way, commandeer any soft patch of rushes. Of course, you might imagine, certainly the lords in their castles had it better, perhaps in material terms, more rooms, actual beds, curtains that at least pretend to offer discretion, and yet their spaces too are full of bodies, servants, relatives, apprentices, messengers, the chandler's boy sleeping by the fire, the cook's niece who wandered in after a storm and never left. Doors are for drafts, not boundaries. Conversations are public. Silence is only for churches, and often not even there. Back in your own snug hovel, every bodily function becomes, if not a group activity, then at least a group awareness. The privy or the chamber pot is in the same room as dinner, tucked behind a partial partition that fools no one. Washing, when it happens, is a public event. A dented basin, a rag, a little awkward laughter, all while the children watch and the goat looks on, deeply unimpressed. Husbands, wives, daughters, grandmothers, lodgers, neighbors on a bad night, everyone learning to interpret the polite half-turn, the hasty cough, the pointed stare at the ground. Night offers cold and rest, but never solitude. Intimate moments for those married folk who hope for such things become brief, whispered negotiations, quick as a prayer, soft as a joke, because someone is always listening, pretending not to, or outright giggling in the straw. Children learn early to sleep through everything, or at least to pretend. Your youngest develops a habit of snoring loudly at opportune times. You suspect he's doing it out of mercy. Livestock, meanwhile, have their own routines. The family cow warms a patch by the door, chewing cud in the darkness. Chickens behave like toddlers with insomnia. A goose takes up residence atop the woodpile and, if you're truly blessed, spends the night reciting the previous day's complaints. Pigs snore as deeply as any grandparent, and an enterprising sheep once rearranged your shoes in the night. If a wolf howls or the wind cries, everyone stirs, humans and animals alike, a brief shivering huddle before sleep chases you again. There's music in this chaos, a rhythm of exhaustion, affection, and resignation. Every cough echoes, every secret is an open one. Family arguments unfold publicly, so do moments of tenderness. Perhaps you stroke Matilde's hair in the dark, and in that gesture is the secret oath every medieval family shares. We are together, even when we drive each other mad. Privacy, if you seek it, is in the world of imagination. A look shared across the table, a whispered joke about the pig's delicate manners, or the silent agreement that this year you won't name another child after a saint who was also the local baker. For some, it's not all bad. Children fall asleep listening to stories, real and fanciful, told by firelight and punctuated by barnyard accompaniment. Old tales mixed with snatches of gossip, who's growing turnips especially well, whose roof let in the worst storm, and sometimes a half-remembered prayer. No one remembers the words exactly, but all remember how the sound of a mother's voice or a father's quiet laugh makes even the coldest night seem just a little less bitter. On days when the mud is thicker or the arguments sharper, you might envy the animals for their lack of opinion. On others, the sound of everyone breathing together, the children, the wife, even the goat, makes the uncertain world outside seem almost manageable. You would never call it cozy, but there is comfort in crowdedness. 1,000 minor problems become one shared
tangled proof that no one is ever truly alone. And in the morning, everyone rises together. Feet shuffle for boots, hands splash water, voices murmur the news of the day. Someone inevitably steps in pig droppings before breakfast. Someone else laughs, and then everyone does. The day waits, so do the chores. The hovel empties. But you know that by nightfall, all of you, human and animal, kin and companion, will find your way back into the great communal nest of straw, snoring, coughing, and dreaming, crowded but never entirely cold. And that, among other things, is what it means to have no privacy in the medieval hovel, to live always, side by side, your life stitched tightly to those you cannot escape.
People say that privacy is the privilege of the rich, but whoever started that rumor definitely never spent a night in a medieval castle. If you ever find yourself wishing you were born noble, longing for velvet sheets, golden goblets, and all the spacious solitude a fairy tale can muster, just imagine this: a vast, echoing room rhymed with damp, high-arched windows, each one rattling whenever the wind gets bored. Nothing is ever still. Every corridor amplifies even the tiniest cough. Every footstep, servant, and mouse seems to come with its own minor parade. You share a bedchamber, yes, but not with just one person. Never just one. The day might find you at councils and feasts, but the night brings a new kind of council, the council of company you never requested. Tonight, you find yourself lying on your back beneath a canopy woven with old moth holes and even older legends, and you are, by all evidence and noise, completely surrounded. Let's walk in. The fire in the corner struggles bravely against drafts that would chill a walrus. The hearth spits and hisses, its heat claimed first by the courtiers who curl, dog-like, around the best spots. The tapestries flutter, not from passing ghosts, though no one would be shocked if they appeared, but from the determined breath of a January wind that cares little for your noble title. You hear the hall as a working song, pages scurrying, dogs dreaming, distant hooves clattering in the icy yard, and above them all, the voices that run through the air like persistent pigeons, whispers, orders, mutters, secrets. Castles and stories are fortresses of dignity and order, but in practice, they're drafty, bustling beehives. The master bed, a symbol of power, of noble right, stands in the thick of it. The lord and lady are there, of course, but so is the lady's maid, dozing upright on a stool, one eye always open. By the foot of the bed, the youngest page sleeps flat on the flagstones, a reward, if you can call it that, for running messages late into the night. If you are a child of the house, you're lucky to have your own pallet squeezed into a corner, as long as your older brother doesn't snore like a goat in a thunderstorm. Curtains? Perhaps, if you are grand enough, but curtains are for keeping out jealous glances, not actual people. Anyone can, and does, slip them aside with the most cursory of excuses. Housekeeper checking the candles, steward looking for lost keys, tutor on an errand with the bad grace to trip and spill half his inkwell at your feet. Sometimes the priest insists on a midnight blessing, just in case. All business, all routine. There are servants everywhere, always. You wake in the small hours to the sound of a chamber pot being emptied, a dog crying to get in, or two kitchen girls tiptoeing through, half terrified of ghosts, half just cold and hoping for a little fire. If you are lucky, that fire burns all night. If not, there is only the sound of your own shivers and perhaps the company of a mouse chewing through your best slippers. Want to talk or hope for any kind of secret conversation? Good luck. The room is a living diary. What you say at night is breakfast gossip by morning. Who argued? Who whispered? Who laughed? Who pulled the blankets too far to the left?
Every yawn, every sigh, every tiny groan from your noble bones echoes up the chimney and out into the wild rumor mill of the castle. Later, at dawn, you hear about yourself from the scullery boy. "Milord seemed troubled last night, begging your pardon," and it takes you a moment to realize he's right, because he was nearby, carrying firewood, and you never noticed him at all. It bears repeating. Privacy, even for the highest born, is a myth. Sometimes there is a wall between your chamber and the next, but it's no thicker than a decent sausage, and just as likely to be punctured by misadventure. If you are a guest, your bedfellow might be a distant cousin, a traveling bishop, a knight with a limp, or all three. People snore, mutter, cry, and on occasion try to negotiate the return of a borrowed comb deep into the night. Blankets are communal property. So are fleas. As for those with ambitions for romance by candlelight, forget what poetry promises. There is always an onlooker, a page returning from his midnight errand, a lady's maid just making sure the tapestries are aligned. Once a well-meaning stable boy gets lost during a storm and curls up right by the Lord's footboard, waking in fright and apologizing so vigorously the echoes make it to the kitchens. The castle at night is, if anything, louder than during the day. From behind thick walls you hear the whistles and moans of the stone itself cooling in the winter air. The wind slaps at ill-fitting shutters. The distant soldiers change watch, and the torch by your door is always being checked, replaced, or, on the worst nights, argued over by rival pages. The lady rolls her eyes and pulls the furs tighter. Lord Oswald places his foot on the dog, hoping to steal some body heat. Someone's reading palms by lamplight. Someone else is softly, doggedly snoring their way through the family genealogy. If you need to, say, wash before bed, there will be an audience, curious, bored, or just creatively helpful. If you wish to pray, or pretend to, it is best to choose a part of the room where the light is dim and the audience few. Chances are the priest will join you, offer unsolicited advice, and promptly fall asleep between verses. In the morning, the sun peeks through a slit in the wall, and everyone, family, retainers, and mice, awake as one. Pillows are punched into shape, chamber pots are shuffled outside, and a parade of servants bustles in with water, clothes, and plates of breakfast food that probably spent the night guarded by 2 cats and a small, dogged rat. Someone yawns, someone complains, everyone dresses hurriedly right where they stand. The day begins not with privacy or ceremony, but with elbows, chilly feet, and the low buzz of conversation that never really stopped in the first place. You leave your chamber knowing that every moment of the night is communal property, and every story will be told at least twice before noon. Even the smallest secrets become a kind of family joke, a running thread in the great tapestry of noble life, a tapestry with quite a few loose ends and twice as many eavesdroppers as you might wish. And so you trudge out to greet the day, robes a little askew, head held high with the special pride only a noble can muster after a night spent in the company of every relative, servant, and pet in the castle. Alone? Never. But in such company, you're never truly bored either. And in the end, maybe that's almost as rare as privacy itself. There are nights even the most dutiful hearts would rather forget. Nights when your back aches from chopping wood, your head rings with the shouts of children, and the wind wailing through every hole in the roof, and all you want is sleep. Just once, just tonight. But history, as ever, has other plans. Especially in the Middle Ages, when not even fatigue could excuse you from a different, more delicate obligation. Marital intimacy. Or, as the confessor will call it tomorrow, the conjugal debt. It's the sort of night when Mathilde sighs, burrowing into her sour straw pillow. Johann, beside her, is already halfway gone with exhaustion, but somewhere in the space between hope and habit, one of them lingers a little too long before closing their eyes. Maybe Mathilde touches his shoulder, or Johann mumbles, "Not tonight," without looking over. The words hang in the smoky air, heavier than they should be, and suddenly you're not alone with your thoughts. Not at all. There is always an audience, even if it wears an invisible robe and carries a ledger filled with faults. Because here, in these drafty evenings, exhaustion can be a sin. The church said so. Marriage was a contract, and that contract had clauses, so many clauses, about duty and satisfaction and debts that wouldn't vanish just because the cow escaped again or your youngest had night carers for the third week in a row. Not tonight, spoken aloud or only thought, is never just a private decision. It echoes, it multiplies, and by sunrise, it sits heavy on your soul as you shuffle to Mass, wondering if the neighbors heard, or if, worse, your spouse intends to tell the priest. Guilt is handed out freely in the Middle Ages, and nowhere is it easier to acquire than in declining in advance, however weary, however gentle. The sin of refusal was not marked in a chore wheel or tallied among misdeeds by the hearth. It was a matter for the confessional, where you would kneel, cold stone digging into your knees, and admit that you'd turned away your partner, not for sin, but for fatigue, or for worry, or, let's be honest, because you just weren't in the mood. The priest listens, half asleep, blinking away midnight candle wax and the memories of 1,000 such confessions before. He nods with a practiced gentle patience because refusal is common, but never trivial. He may quote a saint or two, mention spousal duty, and remind you, softly or sternly, depending on parish custom, that the marital bed is not a place for selfishness or sloth. He suggests a few Hail Marys, a whispered prayer for patience, maybe even a nice word to your spouse at the fire tonight. Don't let the sun go down on your refusal, he'll warn, as if the sun and desire keep the same timetable, which, for anyone with livestock and children, is almost never true. If confessional drama is not enough, the middle-aged world provides plenty of other incentives for compliance. Gossip moves faster than water, pooling in the churchyard, the well, and the corner of the tavern where the ale is barely strong enough to dull embarrassment. A refusal too often repeated is not merely a private failing, but a public rumor. Did you hear? Mathilde says no, even when the calendar is clear. Or, Johann looks tired, doesn't he? I saw Mathilde at the priest's door just yesterday. The community, a living, breathing quilt of human frailties, knows whose house is quiet too many nights in a row. And there are stories, as old as the parish, meant to scare children into obedience and spouses into submission. Stories of crops failing, milk turning sour, sheep running off into the wood, all blamed somehow on the coldness of a marriage bed. They say a wife who refuses too often might cause her husband to look elsewhere, a sin for both, but one shouldered more heavily by the woman. Yet just as often, a husband's refusal becomes a source of sympathetic sighs at the washhouse, subtle looks exchanged at market, a reason to pray for patience and rain in equal measure. The price of refusal is never only embarrassment or gossip, but penance, both formal and informal. You might be assigned extra prayers, a fast on bread and water, as if you weren't already short on both,
or simply the reminder that to withhold oneself is to threaten the harmony of the household and, if you believe the priest, the community entire. For those who are bold, refusal repeated could even become grounds for annulment. Not an easy option, not a kind one, but possible in the rarest, most desperate cases. Enough of a specter to make even the most exhausted heart reconsider. There are coarse loopholes and long-suffering complaints. Illness, holy days, the stricter fasts of the church calendar serve as brief reprieves. Not tonight, it is Lent. Works better than not tonight, I am tired. The church gives with one hand and takes with the other. If procreation is the holiest purpose, then abstinence, timed right, must be just as sacred. But these are rare indulgences, and everyone, Johann, Mathilde, their friends, the nobility across the river in their echoing communal bedrooms, knows the toll exacted when too many nights end with back turned and hands withdrawn. Yet for many, the penalty is not formal at all. It's a slow accumulation of resentment, of jokes whispered too sharply in the morning, of extra chores left undone, bread kneaded with a little less care. Every household finds its rhythm, some fueled by kindness, some by habit, a few by affection that survives in spite of all rules and obligations. But always, running underneath, is the worry will saying not tonight once too often bring something worse than gossip. Will the balance tip and duty become burden, love eclipsed by law? If you listen in the dark, you'll hear 1,000 marriages living out this silent negotiation, the swallowed disappointment, the quiet sigh of relief, the whispered apology between two people who know there is comfort in compliance, but sometimes, just sometimes, a greater comfort in mercy. For all the rules and penances, it is this, mercy, humor, the willingness to make a joke of what cannot be changed, that saves marriages far more often than any prayer recited at dawn. So you rise with the sun, a little more tired than you wish, and greet Mathilde or Johann with the gentle private code learned over years, a glance, a smile, a shoulder squeezed as the fire warms, a silent agreement to try again another night. The world outside is cold but predictable. The world inside, no matter how small, is lived loved compromise, one tiny forgiveness at a time. And whatever the priest may say, you both know that tonight and every night your marriage is made not only of debts and duties, but of the quiet courage to say yes and the weary, forgiving wisdom sometimes to say no.
Some nights, the weight of the world seems heavier than others. You trudge back inside from muddy chores or cold corridors, your head full of frost and fatigue, and all you want is sleep, perhaps a quiet night, free from tasks and tally marks and the endless list of things left undone. Sometimes Mathilde feels it too. She holds herself a little tighter as she slips beneath the old wool blanket, and for once, neither of you say anything except the whispered goodnight you learned as children, before either of you understood what marriage or duty would really mean. But as the fire dims and the coughs and sighs of your crowded hovel fade into the hush, you remember, tonight, as with every night, isn't quite your own. Everything in your world, from bread to blankets to the very shape of the year, is owned by custom, by calendar, by the shifting winds of expectation. And nowhere are those expectations more sneaky or more laden with trouble than in the marriage bed, where "not tonight" is not just a phrase, but a secret, a confession, and sometimes, astonishingly, a sin. It's easy to imagine, looking back through centuries, that refusal would be a private matter.
Who else could possibly care whether tired husbands or weary wives turned away, just for once, under the straw and in the dark? But in the medieval world, privacy is a rare coin, and when it comes to the union of marriage, no door, no curtain, no castle wall is ever truly thick enough to keep the world, or the church, completely out. If you say not tonight, there's a ripple, sometimes small, sometimes swift. Maybe your voice is gentle, just a sigh as you roll away, promising tomorrow with a hope you only half believe. Maybe it's silent, the kind of refusal delivered by closed eyes and the careful, unmoving hands of one who has been tired for so long they have forgotten what desire used to feel like. Or perhaps, some nights, the no is sharper, spoken out loud, irritated, snapped through impatience or wounded pride, punctuated by the restless creak of the old bed frame as you both shift away from each other, pulled by different tides. But still, the refusal lingers. It swirls in the smoky air, mixing with memories and duty, until it seeps out into the world beyond your little home. Because in the Middle Ages, marriage is both contract and sacrament, a union not just between you and yours, but under the watchful eyes of heaven and the equally curious ears of every neighbor in town. The Church, quick to remind, teaches that spousal intimacy is not a luxury for the lucky, but a debt owed each to the other, a duty as regular and predictable as the rising sun, and sometimes just as impossible to avoid. If you say not tonight, there's a ripple, sometimes small, sometimes swift. Maybe your voice is gentle, just a sigh as you roll away, promising tomorrow, with a hope you only half believe. Maybe it's silent, the kind of refusal delivered by closed eyes and the careful, unmoving hands of one who has been tired for so long they have forgotten what desire used to feel like. Or perhaps, some nights, the no is sharper, spoken out loud, irritated, snapped through impatience or wounded pride, punctuated by the restless creak of the old bed frame as you both shift away from each other, pulled by different tides. But still, the refusal lingers. It swirls in the smoky air, mixing with memories and duty, until it seeps out into the world beyond your little home. Because in the Middle Ages, marriage is both contract and sacrament, a union not just between you and yours, but under the watchful eyes of heaven and the equally curious ears of every neighbor in town. The Church, quick to remind, teaches that spousal intimacy is not a luxury for the lucky, but a debt owed each to the other, a duty as regular and predictable as the rising sun, and sometimes just as impossible to avoid. If you say, not tonight, it's not just a minor failing or a private bit of weariness. It's a risk to the peace in your home, the fabric of your village, the balance of desires, the broad, fragile net of grace that keeps temptation and wandering thoughts at bay. Refusing except for reasons allowed by the Church, illness, holy days, certain long fasts, and especially noisy goat, may bring penance in the form of prayer or restitution. Often it brings guilt, too, the sort that clings longer than the mud on your boots. Sometimes the price is more than spiritual. In whispered stories, there are those who refuse too often and find the price paid in the cold edge of a lover's withdrawal, in the silence that creeps into daily chores, in the way meals are suddenly quieter, or bread unaccountably harder to cut. The unspoken deals of marriage shift. Resentments pile up. Perhaps the village gossips start to snicker as one partner spends more time in the fields, or the noble couple's separate apartments seem less a privilege and more a cold, lonely sentence. Rarely, but not never, things go further. There are stories, embroidered with more drama than accuracy, of village women who go straight to the priest, dragging their husbands before the church court for repeated neglect, of men who, finding only refusal,
wander near the alehouse in the company of others. In the grand halls of law, the repeated "not tonight" can, and has, become the shadow lurking behind the right for annulment, a formal, public declaration that a union cannot truly be a marriage if its most basic promise remains unpaid. Yet for most, the daily reckoning is quieter and closer. A couple negotiates, sometimes with words, sometimes just with glances, the weary economy of want, exhaustion, obligation, and desire. Tonight, one asks, quietly hopeful. Tomorrow, the other answers, equally quiet, hoping it will do. And the world keeps turning, the saints keep watching, and in the hush of the sleeping house, two hearts bound by law and land and so many years of duty drift together or apart, night by night. Of course, no human system is perfect. There are always excuses, sometimes legitimate, often creative. No one can blame a partner for falling asleep during prayers or for suddenly remembering an urgent need to check on the soup, the fire, the cows, or the weather. The church calendar, too, becomes a shield. Not tonight, it's the vigil of St. Agnes. Not tonight, tomorrow's the fast. Occasionally, even the saints are thanked in the morning for providing so many feasts, so many ways to justify a little rest. Still, beneath rules and recitations, real lives rumble on. There is in the heart of even the rule-bound medieval marriage a river of good sense and shared weariness. Mercy, as it turns out, is sometimes the strongest glue. Matilde may roll over and say no 3 nights in a row, but then bring Jean an extra piece of cheese the next day, or mend his socks, or tease the children into laughter during the long afternoon. Jean may sigh and grumble, but he splits extra wood, carries water before she asks, and remembers on feast days to bring home a sprig of wild herb for the pot. Over time, the ledger of refusal fades beneath the steady handwriting of patience, humor, kindness, those small gifts that make the contract of marriage something more than tally and debt. And as for confession, the world is full of more serious sins than exhaustion, more urgent crimes than a night spent in silence and temporary solitude. The priest, after all, is just as tired as anyone else and likely to prescribe only a muttered prayer and a reminder to consider each other, to be gentle, to try again when the timing is right. So the nights roll on, both in the smallest hovels and coldest castle chambers. Not tonight becomes sometimes a defense and sometimes a sorrow, but always a part of the shared, tangled story of life. For every penance, there is a joke made up between the sheets. For every rule, a kindness. For every moment of distance, a chance that tomorrow things might be different. If the weight of not tonight can threaten to tip the household balance, it's opposite. The forgiveness that comes in the morning, the shared smile, the silent agreement to try again, may tip it quietly back again. In the end, for all the church's warnings and a world's worry, it is not the refusal that breaks a marriage, but the forgetting, perhaps, to forgive it. And so, when you find yourself, whether tonight or some other, too worn, too worried, too full of life's 100 chores to say yes, remember that even in a world of rules and rumor, kindness is the only answer that ever really lasts.
The story continues, as it always does, with a quiet night settling over straw beds and smoky rafters. The work of the world trickles to a hush, leaving only the hiss of the fire and the slow, accustomed shuffle of limbs into beds that are always slightly too crowded. Tonight we rest our gaze on Mathilde, and on all the Mathildes, Agathas, Annes, and unnamed women whose whole lives circle round the idea of what is properly owed and what can never quite be repaid. By now, everyone has learned that peasant life is not about comfort or privacy or gentle romance by firelight, But for a woman, it isn't even about partnership in quite the way you might picture. It is about a contract written so quietly and so deep that it almost passes for nature, a promise that cannot be revoked or set down, a duty so constant it vanishes into habit. To be a wife in these times is to know that from your wedding day to your last, you are a debtor, bound not to gold or harvests, but to a conjugal balance sheet no one else but the church pretends to keep. It begins early. There's the cheerful, relentless training, how to patch, how to scrub, how to nurse, how to smile in all the right moments. And before a girl is fully grown, the world has already taught her that a wife owes more than just labor. She owes her very self, and chiefly, she owes her body to her husband's rights. The conjugal debt, they call it, as if comfort and affection could truly be measured like a tithe of wheat or a basket of eggs. No priest bothers to ask if she is weary, or if every fiber in her body aches from a day's work, or if her mind drifts to simpler hungers than duty. No, the law is clear. A husband may demand his rights, and to refuse is a sin that stains the soul as heavily as neglecting the fields or failing to feed the hearth. If Mathilde turns away, tonight or any other, she knows it will be counted, not just in heaven's mysterious ledger, but in the sideways glances by the fire, the coldness of breakfast, the gossip quietly spreading at the well or the bakehouse. And sooner or later, her refusals may be recited in the confessional, each one careful as seeds laid out for planting, each one a point of pride or shame or justification, depending on who is telling the tale. But unlike all debts, this one is never paid off. It is a running account, invisible and yet as real as the ache in her back and the tiny persistent guilt that tightens her chest when she sighs, "Not tonight." On holy days and fasts, she finds brief reprieve, the calendar's iron logic her unlikely ally. But on all the ordinary nights, cold, crowded, loud with snoring and the restless movements of livestock, she is counted on to answer each gesture, each hint, each wordless expectation. This is the weight that defines a wife's existence, passed on mother to daughter through bread dough and quiet whispers behind hands. Never say no too easily, child. Never say yes without counting the day, the mood, the eyes that watch from heaven and earth. If she is lucky, her husband is gentle, slow to anger, willing to wait when she pleads the calendar or a tender side. If she is unlucky, the debt is pressed hard and fast with little kindness and less patience, a measure of her duty that leaves no change for comfort. Even love, if it comes, is shaped by the debt. In stolen moments, when the mood is kind, when laughter slips through fatigue, she finds that affection grows in the cracks. But affection is not the fertilizer, duty is. The labor of wives is endless, 1,000 chores before dawn, 1,000 ways to shoulder the blame when harvests are poor or tempers are sharp. The world tells her that a good wife is a busy one, a meek one, a fertile one, a forgiving one. She carries it all without complaint, mostly because she must. Complaint is a costly delicacy, reserved only for those with no neighbors or no need of bread. Mathilde is like so many, finds small ways to balance the scales. She learns which headaches will be believed, which airs best feigned, which feast days to invoke when the years grow heavy and the straw bed feels more duty than dream. On her good days, she laughs while kneading dough, tells stories to the children who are both her legacy and her purpose, and for a short time she forgets what is owed. But the world never lets her forget for long. In the noble house, the story is the same, only gilded at the edges. Lady Beatrice waits in her drafty chamber, the bed too large and the might-be privacy a thin fiction. Her obligations are weighed by lawyers and priests, by stewards and anxious promises of alliance. Here, the debt is both personal and political. Her body not just a site of dedication, but of dynasty. Refusal is not just a sin, but a scandal. It can shift fortunes, stoke rumors, invite mother-in-laws and clerics into the bedroom to quiz her on intention. Should the nobleman neglect his duty, a wife might, on rare, desperate days, claim her rights in a court of law. But most of the time, as across the river in the hovel, enforcement is simply what it is everywhere, an economy of patience, negotiation, and endurance. Whether noble or common, a wife is taught to carry her burdens quietly, lest she bring calamity on her household, censure to her name, or worse, a hint that the world's order is askew. Still, for all this, the wives of the world do what women have always done best: adapt, console, create. There is pride in cleverness, the art of knowing when to say yes, when to plead the saints, when to tempt with fresh bread instead of open arms. There is power, small but real, in knowing every pulse of the household and every story told between the lines. On some nights, when the world grows still, Mathilde dreams, not of escape, but of small freedoms, of permission to want or not want, to speak desire and to speak its opposite without the cost of conscience. On waking, she shakes off the wish and counts the children by the fire and the loaves in the oven, and tells herself, as women do, that happiness is what she makes of it. In the end, a wife's existence is measured not just in chores or children or confessions, but in the quiet triumphs of surviving another day, another season, another set of expectations pressed upon her shoulders. Duty never vanished, but kindness sometimes did. The burden does not end, but neither does the hope that, somewhere between the tallying of debts and the murmurs of the old women at the well, a little softness, a little humor, and a little grace might make even the oldest burden bearable. Years on, when the world has shifted and new wives rise to take her place, Mathilde's laugh still echoes in the straw and under the lintel where she hung her bread to cool. The debt never quite defined her, not entirely. In every crowded house and smoky kitchen, there was always just enough stubbornness, just enough wit, and just enough shared story to carve out a piece of herself that belonged to no one, not even duty. By now, you've learned that medieval marriage is a maze of obligations and negotiations. The conjugal debt, a household bustling with relatives and livestock, calendars crowded with forbidden days, and privacy barely more than a rumor. Yet sneaking beneath all of this, like a particularly persistent draft, lurks another power, one that manages to slip between partners even on the most ordinary of nights. This is the presence not only of saints and priests, but of rules written in ink and fear. A set of instructions that seem as if some theologian with too much time and not enough romance took it upon himself to climb right into your bed and never quite leave. You and your spouse find yourselves together after a day that lasted a year, knees bruised by chores, foreheads touched with bread flour and disappointment, hoping maybe, just maybe, for a moment's simple comfort before sleep starts pulling on your limbs. But here, as the moon wobbles overhead and the goat finishes her last midnight rant in the corner, intimacy is rarely just about you. It is about the rules, doctrines whispered by the church, parish customs delivered with all the subtlety of a sermon, and the ceaseless, awkward commentary of theologians who seem to consider your marriage their favorite nighttime lecture topic. It starts with the rules themselves. Not the ordinary rules of manners or taste, but the kind that tumble out in painstaking detail from men who have spent a lifetime thinking about what other people do and when and how. You might have thought once that marital closeness was a private business. Two people beneath a blanket, seeking each other out for companionship, for comfort, or simply for the oblivion of sleep. But in the wisdom of the age, every action, every intention, every sigh, every touch is suspect, if not supervised by a higher interpretation. The church lays down not only the purpose, procreation, always procreation, but the choreography, which acts are permitted, when, and with what mindset. As if affection itself were a recipe subject to ecclesiastical review. It's as if St. Augustine himself is sitting there by the fire, quietly frowning at any innovation. Intention is as important as action. According to the finest minds in the monastery, you and Mathilde must intend for a child, whether or not you wish for one, and certainly must not pursue any joy for its own sake. If you do, you are told, you must later confess it. If you do not, you must justify your restraint by the calendar, your health, or the omnipresent threat of famine. Even in the castle, rules nestle under the velvet. Lady Beatrice and Lord Oswald, staring at each other across the luxury of 5 thick curtains and a mattress stuffed with goose feathers, know perfectly well what is expected, not only from their mothers-in-law, but from Parisian canon lawyers, local abbots, and theologians whose letters reach farther than any rumor. And just as you tilt towards each other, hoping to find closeness or at least a truce in the dark, another rule emerges. The list never ends. The church's teachings, delivered pointedly from the pulpit or the confessional, chart out forbidden days and even forbidden ways. There are rules about clothing, about posture, about time of day, about who may ask and how often. There are endless rules about what not to do and when not to do it, and how to feel more guilty for desiring comfort when some saint or theologian has decreed otherwise. Perhaps the most awkward of all, you are both urged to maintain chastity within marriage. Not actual abstinence, as that would be a scandal, unless properly scheduled, but a kind of inward cleanliness, where even the shadow of pleasure is best confessed away by dawn. If a passing moment brings joy, or, heaven help you, a twinkle of laughter, be prepared to count it as a minor fault. On your knees in the cold chapel, the priest will assign 3 prayers for the misdemeanor of enjoyment, and possibly a stern glance if he suspects you're not sufficiently penitent. And so it is that marriage, already tangled by calendar and crowd, becomes the most regulated partnership imaginable, a contract in which every clause has a commentary, every gesture a potential theological footnote. Even illness, the universal excuse, must be sufficiently grave. I was tired rarely satisfies the requirements of the confessor, who has his own list to keep. If you are fortunate, you may encounter a lenient priest, or a busy one, who prescribes general mercy to all who request it. For most, though, there was always the weight of doing things not just the right way, but the permitted way, the way that will pass muster at the next confession or next neighborly gossip. Still, humans are stubborn, and medieval humans the most so. You adapt. You learn over time to smuggle affection between the rules, to share a joke in the straw, to agree, without words, on which requirements shall be strictly observed, and which bent a little when the wind shrieks under the door. The rules say only on Wednesdays outside of Lent, and never during a moon eclipse unless harvest is threatened. Mathilde teases with a sly look. Johann sighs, and they both turn, not so much in defiance,
as in weary solidarity, a team against all the theologians who have not patched a roof or rocked a feverish child at midnight. Sometimes, though, the rules catch up with you. A child tattles to the priest about a laugh overheard after Vespers, or a neighbor, hoping for favor, remarks on your suspicious cheerfulness come Sunday. The next day, you are called in, made to remember the importance of intention, the gravity of joy, the thin line between sacred duty and sinful delight. You promise to do better, to do less, or at least to keep your laughter quieter, out of earshot of those who are paid to frown. Meanwhile, the theologians keep writing. Thick books and thin ones, new rulings pasted atop the old, all declaring what is natural and what is forbidden. Never once asking those living under their rules how they might find peace. Each generation inherits a longer list, and each couple learns which bits to treasure, which to ignore, and which, in the end, to forgive between themselves. Yet, beneath all this ceremony, you survive. The awkwardness becomes custom, the rules become background noise, and the small kindnesses, an extra blanket, a ribald joke, a squeeze of the hand when the priest looks away, become your secret code against a world intent on watching, judging, and recording every heartbeat as a matter of doctrine. As the night lengthens and the wind hammers the walls, you close your eyes with the knowledge that, rules or not, tomorrow will come, and with it, another opportunity to slip a bit of unruly tenderness past the theologians lurking in the corners of your quiet, beleaguered home. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find room for one more secret laugh, one that canon lawyers never counted on.
It's a strange thing how fiercely the world can insist on rules, on debts and duties and endless whispering calendars. And yet, in the cracks between dogma and exhaustion, people still find their way to something softer. For all the theologians, with their ledgers inked in suspicion and their lofty warnings against laughter, not even the longest litany of restrictions could smother the longing for a gentle word or a glance that meant, "I see you, even in all this mess." So you listen, tonight, through the 1,000 household noises, the cough from the fireside, the drip from the eaves, the goat rearranging herself pointedly in the dark, and what rises to the top isn't penance or procedure or even the blurry threat of sin. It's the heartbeat beneath it all, pulsing quietly through straw beds and stone castles alike, the hope that, against all odds, you aren't alone. Life has always had its duties. For Matilda and Johann, and for Lady Beatrice and Lord Oswald, and even for those whose names no one remembers. The world is a crowded tangle of expectation. The church decrees the purpose. The calendar decrees the when. The neighbors note the how often. And the children, wide-eyed and sleepy, seem to remember every embarrassing detail. And still, beneath that, something stirs. You'd think, with so much weighing on every action, the need for children, the price of refusal, the ceaseless catalog of what is and isn't allowed, that affection would be flattened out by sheer repetition, like dough rolled too thin. But instead what happens is quieter, less dramatic, a slow growth right in the heart of all the careful tedium. Perhaps it's a habit, Johann setting aside the first slice of bread for Matilda, or Matilda stitching the nicest patch on Johann's oldest tunic. Perhaps it's in the way Beatrice rubs the chill from Oswald's hands, even as she teases him about remembering the wrong saint's day, again. These acts aren't written anywhere in the law books. They don't erase the debts or dissolve the calendar or grant immunity from the priest's gentle scoldings.
They're almost invisible, really. And yet, over time, they become the glue that binds the hard edges of duty together. Some nights, as the wind prowls at the doors and the rules of engagement seem especially heavy, you might notice affection as nothing more spectacular than a shared joke, the kind that makes no sense to anyone else. A wink across the dinner table, exchanged quick while the children bicker about whose turn it is to fetch more wood, the soft snort of laughter when the very serious neighbor insists that St. Aldrich's vigil requires fasting from onions, as if the village ever had enough onions to abstain. It's in this easy banter, seasoned by shared exhaustion and shaped by years of repetition, that fondness hides itself. Maybe it's because the real business of marriage, chopping wood, kneading bread, counting the coins and losses, never leaves much room for grand displays. Or maybe here in the world's basement, where romance is considered suspicious, affection finds a way to sneak around the rules dressed as practicality. Why else would Matilda, exhausted as she is, rise just a shade earlier to sweep the hearth before Johann lurches out of bed? Why else would Johann, who knows exactly how many feast days remain until harvest, still bring a handful of wildflowers back to place awkwardly on the bench, muttering something about keeping spirits up? Over years, these things matter. In the stories that never end up in saints' lives or royal records, it's not the calendar or the penalties of refusal that get remembered. It's the night Matilda risked precious sugar to sweeten Johann's gruel after a fever. The afternoon when Lady Beatrice slipped a hot stone into Oswald's boots, expecting to be teased, and instead got a solemn nod and a rare, quiet thank you. The best stories, the ones told in the pauses between chores or whispered between neighbors when they're sure no priest is listening, are always about kindness. No one recalls who remembered to tally the fasts or kept the best count of abstinent days, but everyone, deep down, remembers the warmth of having someone close enough to understand when not to speak, how to laugh at trouble, or even how to share silence without hurry or expectation. And it's not just marriage either. The whole community lives on these secret currents. Gossip varies stories of affection and irritation alike, and for every tale of infamous refusal or legendary compliance, there's another, quieter tale of the old couple who bickered by day and held hands at night, of the neighbor who looked after your child so you could rest, or the midwife who brewed a little extra broth after the fever passed. Affection in this world is rarely pure. It is tangled up with duty, guilt, convenience, and the knowledge that tomorrow you might quarrel about chores or children or saints all over again. But that's the trick of it. The feeling is real, even when it comes wrapped in practicality or cloaked as obligation. It's what makes the never quite private home bearable and turns another hard year of shared burdens into something you might, if no one is listening, dare to call happiness. Late at night, when even the goat is finally quiet and the moon lays stripes across the walls, you might turn toward your partner and find a strange, grateful comfort. The sense that somehow you have both survived another day, and that the rest, rules, debts, and penances, all fades to the background in the gentle hush of belonging. The unspoken truth is this: for all the weight of rules, the circus of duty, and the awkward choreography dictated by theologians who never patched a sock or soothed a child, affection is the point, even when no one says so. It lives in the space between debits and credits, in the glance shared when chores are done, in the small acts that say, without a sermon, I'm here. You matter. Tomorrow we'll muddle through again, together. And that is perhaps the only real magic the medieval world could still produce. A secret so ordinary that no one wrote it down, but everyone, deep down, still hoped to find it beneath the weight of all that duty and dust.
It's a strange thing how fiercely the world can insist on rules, on debts and duties and endless whispering calendars. And yet, in the cracks between dogma and exhaustion, people still find their way to something softer. For all the theologians, with their ledgers inked in suspicion and their lofty warnings against laughter, not even the longest litany of restrictions could smother the longing for a gentle word or a glance that meant, "I see you," even in all this mess. So you listen tonight through the 1,000 household noises, the cough from the fireside, the drip from the eaves, the goat rearranging herself pointedly in the dark. And what rises to the top isn't penance or procedure or even the blurry thread of sin. It's the heartbeat beneath it all, pulsing quietly through straw beds and stone castles alike, the hope that, against all odds, you aren't alone. Life has always had its duties, for Mathilde and Johann, and for Lady Beatrice and Lord Oswald, and even for those whose names no one remembers. The world is a crowded tangle of expectation. The church decrees the purpose, the calendar decrees the when, the neighbors note the how often, and the children, wide-eyed and sleepy, seem to remember every embarrassing detail. And still, beneath that, something stirs. You'd think with so much weighing on every action, the need for children, the price of refusal, the ceaseless catalog of what is and isn't allowed, that affection would be flattened out by sheer repetition, like dough rolled too thin. But instead, what happens is quieter, less dramatic, a slow growth right in the heart of all the careful tedium. Perhaps it's a habit. Johann setting aside the first slice of bread for Mathilde, or Mathilde stitching the nicest patch on Johann's oldest tunic. Perhaps it's in the way Beatrice rubs the chill from Oswald's hands, even as she teases him about remembering the wrong saint's day again. These acts aren't written anywhere in the law books. They don't erase the debts or dissolve the calendar or grant immunity from the priest's gentle scoldings. They're almost invisible, really. And yet, over time, they become the glue that binds the hard edges of duty together. Some nights, as the wind prowls at the doors and the rules of engagement seem especially heavy, you might notice affection as nothing more spectacular than a shared joke, the kind that makes no sense to anyone else. A wink across the dinner table, exchanged quick while the children bicker about whose turn it is to fetch more wood. A soft snort of laughter when the very serious neighbor insists that St. Aldrich's vigil requires fasting from onions, as if the village ever had enough onions to abstain. It's in this easy banter, seasoned by shared exhaustion and shaped by years of repetition, that fondness hides itself. Maybe it's because the real business of marriage, chopping wood, kneading bread, counting the coins and losses, never leaves much room for grand displays. Or maybe here in the world's basement, where romance is considered suspicious, affection finds a way to sneak around the rules, dressed as practicality. Why else would Mathilde, exhausted as she is, rise just a shade earlier to sweep the hearth before Johann lurches out of bed? Why else would Johann, who knows exactly how many feast days remain until harvest, still bring a handful of wildflowers back to place awkwardly on the bench, muttering something about keeping spirits up? Over years, these things matter. In the stories that never end up in saints' lives or royal records, it's not the calendar or the penalties of refusal that get remembered. It's the night Mathilde risked precious sugar to sweeten Johann's gruel after fever, the afternoon when Lady Beatrice slipped a hot stone into Oswald's boots, expecting to be teased, and instead got a solemn nod and a rare, quiet thank you. The best stories, the ones told in the pauses between chores or whispered between neighbors when they're sure no priest is listening, are always about kindness. No one recalls who remembered to tally the fasts or kept the best count of abstinent days, but everyone, deep down, remembers the warmth of having someone close enough to understand when not to speak, how to laugh at trouble, or even how to share silence without hurry or expectation.
And it's not just marriage either. The whole community lives on these secret currents. Gossip varies stories of affection and irritation alike, and for every tale of infamous refusal or legendary compliance, there's another, quieter tale of the old couple who bickered by day and held hands at night, of the neighbor who looked after your child so you could rest, or the midwife who brewed a little extra broth after the fever passed. Affection in this world is rarely pure. It is tangled up with duty, guilt, convenience, and the knowledge that tomorrow you might quarrel about chores or children or saints all over again. But that's the trick of it. The feeling is real, even when it comes wrapped in practicality or cloaked as obligation. Why else would Mathilde, exhausted as she is, rise just a shade earlier to sweep the hearth before Johann lurches out of bed? Why else would Johann, who knows exactly how many feast days remain until harvest, still bring a handful of wildflowers back to place awkwardly on the bench, muttering something about keeping spirits up? Late at night, when even the goat is finally quiet and the moon lays stripes across the walls, you might turn toward your partner and find a strange, grateful comfort, the sense that somehow you have both survived another day, and that the rest, rules, debts, penances, all fades to the background in the gentle hush of belonging. The unspoken truth is this: for all the weight of rules, the circus of duty, and the awkward choreography dictated by theologians who never patched a sock or soothed a child, affection is the point, even when no one says so. It lives in the space between debits and credits, in the glance shared when chores are done, and the small acts that say, without a sermon, I'm here, you matter, tomorrow we'll muddle through again, together. And that, perhaps, is the only real magic the medieval world could still produce, a secret so ordinary that no one wrote it down, but everyone, deep down, still hoped to find it beneath the weight of all that duty and dust.
And so, as the last candle gutters and the embers whisper their sleepy secrets, that's where we'll leave our story tonight. A world where intimacy was measured out, not in tender glances or soppy poetry, but in ledgers, calendars, and the watchful eyes of saints, neighbors, and the world's nosiest priests. The conjugal debt was surely history's most persistent, unromantic obligation. An odd, uncomfortable, sometimes comic little tangle of duty, doctrine, and sheer human hopefulness. In a place where privacy was scarce, romance risked public scandal, and every knot tonight could have spiritual, social, or marital consequences, it's a wonder anyone ever snuck kindness, tenderness, or even just a warm smile into the cracks between rules. If, after this sleepy trip through medieval marriage, you're feeling just a little more grateful for the gentle freedoms of your own night, maybe leave a like to let us know you're still awake. Or perhaps drop a comment with the time you're listening, whether it's 2:13 a.m. with the rain outside, or a quiet afternoon nap with the cat purring on your feet. It's always a surprise and a joy to see where and when our little travels find you. And if you'd like to drift off to more stories that make history soft, slow, and a little bit sillier than anyone dared admit, go ahead and subscribe. Hit that bell as if you were warning the village that tonight's off limits, and tomorrow we'll take you somewhere stranger still. There's always room for new dreamers around our hearth. Thank you for spending this night with us and with the ghosts of Mathilde, Johann, saints, sinners, and the odd livestock companion who never got the memo about privacy. However heavy your modern day may be, may your dreams be lighter than law, softer than straw, and owned by no one but yourself. Good night, and may your ledger, at last, be blissfully empty.
And who in ways both